So when you start looking on the ALA site, the article on your presentation at the British Interplanetary Society is probably the most important article that's being put out there, because unlike other ones that simply go through the narrative like rocket fuels and all of the other stuff, you were in direct competition, or you were directly with somebody who could correct you because he has the narrative. He's been doing it for 50 years. He has the official story. He has all of the documentation on it. He's done presentations for all of the missions for what, the 20th, the 30th, the 40th, and the 50th anniversaries on top of that. So I don't think anybody that's working at NASA could even compare to the knowledge that he has on the Apollo missions. So without any further delay, I'm going to turn my microphone off and just let you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. I appreciate your knowledgeable introduction to the British Interplanetary Society, of which I am a member. Now, as you said, the British Interplanetary Society was founded in Liverpool in 1933, so they're in their 90th year, which is quite an achievement in itself. They have their headquarters in London, south of the river, at a location called Vauxhall, at what they now have christened the Arthur C. Clarke House, in honor of one of their more prominent members, Arthur C. Clarke, who was the scriptwriter on 2001: A Space Odyssey and a very well-known science fiction writer. Now, I was invited, as you say, to address the British Interplanetary Society about my contention that humans have not landed on the lunar surface, because the British Interplanetary Society is an advocate for space travel. And they support NASA, they supported Apollo. Neil Armstrong was an honorary member. I believe Buzz Aldrin was also an honorary member of the Society. So they are entirely supportive of NASA's narrative. And here was me coming along, trying to, shall we say, shine light onto some of the darker corners of the Apollo missions. That's what I've been doing for a while. I was invited to address the Society. They hold regular meetings in their headquarters, the Arthur C. Clarke House. It's well organized. They have numerous speakers there. So I was one, and it was announced by the British Interplanetary Society that I would be doing this. Well, that ignited a Twitter storm in modern parlance, a real pushback on certain websites which said, why would this honourable society invite somebody like Marcus Allen to address them about Apollo? This is ridiculous. And if they're going to go ahead with it, well, they should at least put up somebody who can refute what he has to say so that we get the truth of it. That was their approach. So I thought, okay, I'll go along with this, and invited my refuter, as you say, Jerry Stone, who's a fellow of the British Interplanetary Society, been a long-time member, and he speaks regularly about Apollo. So he was the obvious person to choose as somebody who would be able to refute what I said. His knowledge would be extensive, and so anything I claimed that was incorrect would be immediately corrected. I would be exposed as a charlatan and expelled from polite society. Well, that was the proposal. Now, this caused the British Interplanetary Society a certain amount of anguish, because they didn't intend there to be any controversy about it. I was just to present information so that they could discuss it and refute it where appropriate. So I thought, okay, well, one way to do this would be to have a private meeting with Jerry Stone and show him everything that I intended to use during my presentation, all the photographs, they're all on my computer, so he could see what I was going to be talking about, and he could prepare notes, and he could address any inadequacies in my story. So we met in a coffee shop in London. I showed him over 2 hours every photograph I was going to be using, explained why I was using them, explained what the problems were with the photographs. It was a fairly comprehensive view in my experience. I had nothing to hide. I wasn't going to spring on him any photographs I hadn't already shown him. So I could be refuted with confidence if that was the intention. So after the initial storm of protest from people saying, why would hoax believers, that's who I'm, a hoax believer, be invited even to the British Interplanetary Society? So what they did was to ask me to change the format of my presentation. And instead of giving the regular presentation, which I do, which is available to see, anybody can see it online. Robert Williams has archived many of the talks I've done, and some of them cover the subjects which I would be talking about at the British Interplanetary Society. Anyway, they said, no, what we want you to do is just show the photographs and explain your problems with them. So I said, okay, I'll do that. That's not a problem, because that's the main purpose of my presentations, is to look at the photographs and look at the anomalies and the inconsistencies and the unexplained details in them. I was quite familiar with them, so I didn't have a problem with doing that. So instead of having an hour to do the presentation, I would have 40 minutes to present my case. Then Jerry Stone would come along with 40 minutes to refute what I had to say. And then there would be question and answers from the audience. I was quite happy with that as a format, because I felt that the British Interplanetary Society needed to regain the confidence of their wider support. I first met Jerry Stone back in late 2011, and the talk was scheduled for April 2012. This is before the London Olympics, just to put it into historical times. So there I was at the British Interplanetary Society, where I was welcomed by the president, Alistair Scott. He was a very nice gentleman. He showed me around the building. I hadn't been there before. He showed me around the building, explained what everything was about. So I was welcomed very cordially, very friendly. No problem at that point at all. So when I gave my presentation, I was the first to speak and presented my case. You can see the talk I did. It's in 3 parts: my talk, Jerry Stone's talk, and then the question and answer session. They're on the British Interplanetary Society website, where you can see them. They're still there. So I proceeded with my talk, showed various photographs which I was just going to discuss and ask questions about them, and expecting from this knowledgeable group of people some refutation, some pushback. They were very polite. They were asked not to interrupt during my talk and could ask questions afterwards. So I finished to polite applause, which was gratifying. And then Jerry Stone took the floor, and his first words were, well, I don't know what to say, which seemed an odd thing to say from somebody who's used to giving presentations and was there to defend Apollo and NASA's portrayal of it. Anyway, he then proceeded to give what I discovered later was the talk he regularly gives to schools about Apollo, which is obviously very supportive of NASA, supportive of Apollo. But he didn't mention anything that I'd said. He didn't refute anything I presented. He didn't refute anything I had argued for. He just proceeded with his own presentation. After he'd finished the question and answers, and the first question was, Jerry, you didn't really refute anything Marcus said, did you? To which he had no reply that I was aware of. Most of the questions were actually directed at me, asking for clarification about certain points I made. It was well monitored by the moderator of the talks, Colin Philp, who is the organizer of the talks. So it was in his interest that things didn't get out of hand. And to be fair, the questions were quite legitimate, quite straightforward. People who had experience of working for NASA. Now, one of the questions came from the editor of the British Interplanetary Society House Journal, Spaceflight magazine. And that editor was David Baker, who is well known for having worked for NASA. He's British, but he worked for NASA during the 60s, early 70s. He worked on many of their programs, so he was somebody who had considerable knowledge of the subject. And he asked me one question. He said,
quickly, rather than hogging this, I'd just like to say, Marcus, you said something right at the very beginning. You said, I do not doubt that man landed on the moon. Is that correct? So in fact, you are not advocating that man did not land on the moon, but merely saying that to try to make this a more aesthetically delightful visual epic, some of the photography was hammed up in a studio somewhere.
Now my answer to that was,
the Apollo record was enhanced.
Now bear in mind, this is 2012, this is over 11 years ago. I've subsequently discovered that no human has landed on the moon. Now, I've been taken to task for that reply. Oh, Marcus really believes that man has landed on the moon, so why is he saying they haven't? No, that's not the point. The point is that David Baker is a highly respected editor and author. He's written many books. He's written encyclopedias on the subject of space travel. He knows his subject. You could say I was being British. I was being polite. I was not trying to argue with somebody I do respect for his knowledge and ability to write about space. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe I should have just come straight out and said, no human has landed on the moon. But I didn't do that. What I have gained over the last 11 years is considerable knowledge and information that nobody has landed on the moon for various reasons, which I didn't go into at the time, partly because the main one I was not even aware of at the time, which is to do with the effect of vacuum on equipment and on humans, let alone the radiation effect of traveling to the moon, which is exposed to all the radiation of space, or the heat generated in the spacecraft by the radiant energy of the sun. Those are the three main reasons I would give now for confirming that humans have not landed on the lunar surface. Anyway, the questions continued. They're quite intelligent questions. Some people who had worked closely with some of the NASA equipment, because I'd made the point that they were all wearing armored gauntlets and operating cameras, which have really quite small control mechanisms. And I said it's inconceivable that under those limitations of use that anybody could operate the photographic equipment which was used on Apollo. There's no dispute about what was used. There were Hasselblad cameras, Mara film cameras, and various other pieces of equipment. So there was a number of questions to do with, well, you could operate quite small objects with the spacesuit gauntlets, which is possibly true if they're not pressurized.
Regarding the gloves or the gauntlets, I've actually had the good fortune to try some on. And as a matter of pride, I took it upon myself that I had to be able to thread the smallest nuts and bolts together. And I managed to do an M4 nut and bolt set within probably about a minute. And that was after fiddling around for maybe 5 minutes. Now, if I could do that in such a short space of time, surely the astronauts who would have had a huge amount of practice, they'd have been more than proficient to be able to handle the cameras.
If they're not pressurized, but they were pressurized, and they were made of, in effect, armored material to prevent against micrometeorite damage. Because if any of the space equipment had become damaged, it would have seriously threatened the well-being of the astronauts if they had to expose themselves to the vacuum of space and all the other problems that we know about when traveling in space. So anyway, question and answers came on. Jerry was asked a few questions. What I haven't mentioned is one of the things that Jerry did, and this is contained in the write-up on the Owlis website, but it is not contained in the recording of the presentation that Jerry Stone gave, where I was compared to a Holocaust denier, which I took grave exception to, because it is totally untrue, that anybody who denies the truth of the Apollo moon landings is equated with a Holocaust denier. And he showed pictures of Auschwitz, pictures of the Holocaust that the Jewish race had to endure during World War II. It was totally uncalled for, totally unnecessary. It didn't even illustrate the point he was trying to make, is that anybody who questions Apollo is obviously a complete idiot and is not in charge of his mental capacities. The question and answer session went on for about the same length as the combined presentations that myself and Jerry made, about an hour and a half, which is considerably longer than anybody had expected. There was considerable interest amongst the British Interplanetary Society members to hear what I had to say. Several of them approached me privately after the talk, when we sort of chatted, and said words to the effect, "I think you're right, but I don't dare say it," not to other members. Because I was prepared to, as you mentioned, into the lion's den I was prepared to go there. I was prepared to be given a very hard time, which in fact I wasn't during the time of my presentation, because everybody decided to hold their comments for later, which is fair enough. It was well organized. It was civilized. It was the sort of debate I was looking forward to. As I said at the beginning of the talk, I hope I will learn from what I hear today. The trouble is, I didn't really learn anything, because Jerry Stone didn't refute what I said. He didn't take any of the photographs I had used and pointed out the errors I made, because I hadn't made any errors. And the members afterwards basically considered that I was quite correct for me to be there to present it. If I was wrong, obviously they would know I was wrong and could point out the errors. But they didn't. They just repeated a lot of NASA's propaganda, which is that we landed humans on the moon. That's what they say, and here's the evidence. Now, if you challenge them, as has happened, David Percy, who's the joint co-author with Mary Bennett of the definitive book on the moon landings, Dark Moon, Apollo and the Whistleblowers, David was challenged, obviously, about some of the comments he made in his book, but was able to back them up with considerable evidence. The idea that he could be wrong, I could be wrong, obviously exists, but there has to be proof of it. Personal attacks are no way to refute somebody's strongly held and eloquently described opinions, as David and Mary have done in their book, and as I hope I did during my presentation. I was very nervous about doing it. Obviously, I was fully aware of the support that the British Interplanetary Society offered to NASA, and I hoped I wasn't defaming their long-held reputation for support of space travel. They're an advocacy group for space travel. I'm an advocate for human space travel. I just want to know that it's real and that we're not being manipulated into believing something which isn't correct, isn't true. So after the talk, I joined the society. I'm still a member today. I find it very interesting because I'm able to receive the British Interplanetary Society publication, Spaceflight, which is very useful for keeping up to date with current developments in the space program. They're obviously now concentrating on the Artemis program and the various problems that has experienced, and possibly Elon Musk's Starship launcher and their attempts to land humans on the moon. And we're finding that there are a lot of problems with landing on the moon. Because if NASA believed their story of what they did back in the 60s and early 70s of landing 12 humans on the lunar surface on 6 missions, 9 missions in total, launching their Saturn V rocket to orbit the moon on Apollo 8, 10, and 13, but landing the other ones, they don't want people to question it. Now, when David Percy was filming his definitive DVD, What Happened on the Moon, he interviewed NASA. Well, he interviewed their media spokesman, Brian Welch, it was at the time. And he was asked to explain certain anomalies in the photographs. And his reply, and presumably supported by the NASA High Command, was,
I'll be honest with you, I think that's pseudo-scientific, nitpicky claptrap.
Which is not a very, very sensible reply. If you're asked a question by a serious filmmaker, which David Percy is, you would expect a serious answer. It didn't happen. It's almost as if NASA have something to hide. Well, I think they do, but we're beginning to find out what it is. That was the completion of my presentation to the British Interplanetary Society. The recording of it is available, minus the Holocaust denying section, because that was cut out before the film was even initially released, for very good reason. It was such an uncalled for comment as to be not worthy even of discussion. I became a member. I'm still a member now. I like what the British Interplanetary Society do. I think they do good advocacy work with schools, with young people. They have very strong programs encouraging interaction with space companies. I've been on several of their trips to satellite manufacturers, where I did ask a question about vacuum and satellites. And so, well, of course we know it exists. We harden against it. We can design satellites which are not affected by the vacuum of space because we know what exists. It appears that NASA don't. The end of my talk generated more comments on certain websites from people who are supportive of NASA, who tried to take me apart. They didn't make any comment about the photographs I was showing. They just attacked me personally. Well, I'm old enough and ugly enough and big enough to withstand that sort of nonsense, because it doesn't really affect me. If somebody's going to take a personal attack on me, it shows they've lost the argument, because they're just attacking the person, not the subject. So I just carry on in my own sweet way. I give talks, I give presentations. Some of them have been viewed by many hundreds of thousands of people. And the work that Robert Williams does now to archive some of these talks has been very valuable, because people still ask me about it. People still talk to me, so I can now refer them to the actual talks and show what they can see for themselves. I'm not trying to make any bold claim for myself. I just say, examine what I've said. And if you don't agree with it, tell me why you don't agree with it, but provide evidence. And that's all. That's all I've ever asked. Oh, just one thing. After I gave the talk, obviously, David Percy and Mary Bennett were fully aware I was doing it, and they had helped me prepare for it. And so Mary contacted me after the talk to ask how it went. And the report I gave to her was the basis of the article, 2 articles, Into the Lion's Den, available on the Owlist website. And it recounts pretty accurately what happened, because I was speaking to her literally 24 hours after I'd finished the talk. So I was fully aware of what was going on, fully aware of what was happening, and explained what the reaction had been. So that gives a reasonably good resume of what happened. Bear in mind, all this happened before the London Olympics of 2012. So we're talking 11 years ago.
So I'd like to ask a question, or put this to you. A NASA proponent who calls himself Phase 52012 and his little clique, they claim that you are for the moon landings and repeatedly display that video recorded at the British Interplanetary Society. What do you say to that?
It's a good point, because he has been a permanent poster of the same information for the last 10 years. And I would say that in those intervening 11 years since I gave the presentation, I have acquired a great deal more information, a great deal more knowledge about the inadvisability of landing humans on the lunar surface. I said that because that was the answer to the question I was asked by David Baker. I think it actually shows up in the Q&A session of the 3rd of the 3 films. David Baker is seen asking me the question, and I'm seen answering the question. I was basically trying to be as polite as possible to somebody who was, in my view, a knowledgeable person who had worked for NASA. He worked on some of the early Apollo programs. He was very knowledgeable about spaceflight. He's written extensively about it. I was not about to, in public, deny what he had spent his life trying to achieve. Basically, be as polite as possible. So whoever you are, Phase 52012, whatever, you can say what you like, but at least put your face to it. At least be honest about it.
Well, that's the other thing. They've been invited on to have a chat with us. Neil's Ben's asked them on, you name it, right? They're not going to go there.
No, because they know that we are knowledgeable about our subject. And if they say things which are incorrect, we'll call them out on it.
Exactly. And here's the other thing. I remember offering one of those guys 500 British pounds to come on for 60 minutes. And not one of those guys would come on to talk, not even using their voice. So
Really?
Why not?
He's been playing that game with how many people for how long now, right?
Yeah.
Come on and I'll have a debate. And it doesn't matter what it is. They won't use the real name. They won't use the real face. They won't use anything. And I look at that. If you're not going to stand up and have a discussion with me and sit and show me your face, it's not worthwhile. You have to defend. If you want to defend your position, you have to do it in person.
Of course you do. And publicly. And what are we looking at there?
That's the back of the rover. So he's kneeling on the seat and looking backwards. But there's 2 guys on there, one behind the other. They're facing backwards on the rover. I mean, that guy doesn't have that large of a backpack on him.
See what you mean? Yep.
Do you have the other photograph of the rover without the guys on it? Just to show what the equipment is that's actually on the machine. That's how high the equipment is on the machine. So you see what he's got for a backpack on there when he's sideways?
It's quite large, that backpack.
It's quite large. But when you look at the other photograph, there's no way that backpack, because he's now facing the camera, could be that large. There's got to be two guys on there.
Well, who took the picture?
Well, it's a Hasselblad.
It's a Hasselblad picture. It's got the crosshairs on it.
It's a Hasselblad photograph, and there's got to be two guys on there.
That's very interesting.
Wow.
Because that's one of those things that shouldn't be.
What? Like I said, bunch of guys messing around on equipment all the time, out ripping it up. Look at the tracks they're making all over the place, just tearing the place up, right? I still find that amusing when Jerry Stone gives his presentation on the rover, and he goes through the official story of the rover and the damage that occurred to it when it arrived, and that the one battery pack didn't work, so it only had two-wheel drive, and then the steering didn't work, so it only had rear-wheel steering. And if you look to see what it takes to lock the front tires straight, basically you got to tip the rover up on its side or lift it up and get underneath to lock it out. There's a pin lock, so you can have four-wheel steering or two-wheel steering for either end, right? But you have to get under there to do it. So he goes through all of that, and then he said, well, they just parked it in the shade and then everything was working again. Like the British Interplanetary Society takes imagination and makes it reality, but they do it through conversation.
It's called consensus viewpoints, because people have to agree with that viewpoint. And Jerry Stone is recognized as an expert on Apollo.
Well, he is on the official story.
Yeah, because
you won't find anybody that has more knowledge on all of the missions, including Apollo 13, because he does presentations on all of them. And he's had that information from NASA long before it was ever published to the general public. He's had all that details. He's had the transcripts, everything, and he's read them and he's studied them. And his knowledge of the official story that NASA wants to present is unsurpassed by anybody else. There isn't anybody alive out there that can go through the official story. And I do mean the official story. And you were up against somebody that if they could have refuted anything you were to say, he was the man to do it.
Oh, yeah, he was.
Oh, here's something I wanted to point out to you.
That's supposed to be the TV camera, isn't it, that one?
That's the TV camera. How come it's got manual controls on it?
I don't know. I wouldn't have thought it would have manual controls.
This camera's supposed to be remotely operated from Houston. How the hell are you going to focus this thing?
If it's manually operated, how can anybody operate it remotely?
You need a monitor to see what you're doing, first of all.
You would, yep. Because you've got pan and tilt. I mean, that's what we saw on Apollo 17 liftoff. The camera panned upwards to follow the craft. We actually know who it was in Houston who was operating it.
Okay, for you to operate these two controls right here, you then need a monitor on the rover.
There it is. It's an aperture and zoom.
So it's a manual control.
And it's manual. Yeah, those are manual. So where's the TV monitor so that they can see what they're doing?
Oh, they don't need that because they got magic eyesight.
Oh, they just talked to Houston? It should be in the transcript when they're talking about a on focus yet. Because they're going to have to focus this thing for Houston.
Well, it's the same way the Hasselblad cameras have got manual focus and manual aperture on the Hasselblad camera to see what you've got. You can't even see where you're pointing it.
So all they can do at Houston is pan it and tilt it, and the astronauts have to set the focus and the aperture because there's no motor on that. That is crazy.
If you're going to set the focus, you've got to see what you've done. Is it correct? Is the focus correct? Because some of the TV images are showing quite close-up images.
Yeah, those are full manual slides, and there's no electronics built in here anywhere to
No, they show the camera, they show the controls, and they show the numbers, and they have everything on it. They show a close-up of the camera so you can see what those slide controls do. But you have to manually focus it or adjust that aperture, and that's what those two handles are for.
Funny little things you find, eh? Every time you look at the photographs. 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 Photographs.